She represents something the kids respect and know they must respect. I saw her tell a girl, she said, "I knew you before you were born," as a way to remind her who she was. And so when we have a shortage of these kinds of adults, our schools actually become less safe. We start to think that we can rely on guards and metal detectors, and guess what? We'll never have enough guards or metal detectors to make our schools safe. And so we've got to focus more on how to build these kinds of relationships in schools that are conducive to learning and conducive to children receiving the kinds of support they need. So I ask you now, if you're in a school, to reflect on who are we disciplining in schools? What's the profile look like? What are the needs that they're bringing that may not be getting addressed? What strategies are we using? Let me ask this. If you were thinking about your own children, how many of you would tell your own children they were acting out to go away for a few days and come back when you'd be ready to behave? Right? That's just insane, right? But that's how we treat our children. People talk about a school to prison pipeline. Well, that pipeline is built by unsupervised children in the street who've been sent out of school and now are prime for delinquency. I was visiting a school like that in Berkeley, California, given a tour by the assistant principal. Very proud of all the renovations in the building and showing me around, takes me to the library, takes me to see the computer lab. We get to his office and there's a little boy about this tall waiting for him. He turns to me, he says, "You see that kid?" He said, "There's a prison cell in San Quentin waiting for that boy right now." So I said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "Well, I can tell by the way he behaves. He's out of control, he's rude, he's disrespectful. His father's in prison, his brother's in prison. So it's just a matter of time before he ends up there too." So then I turned to him, I said, "Well, given what you know about this boy, what is the school doing to keep him out of prison?" And he looks at me like he's surprised, like he doesn't think that's his job. In fact, what he was about to do was to take this boy and assign him to long-term suspension with his sick grandmother, where they would send the work home and then effectively wash their hands. Now, what you should know is that assistant principal was an African-American man, and the boy was an African-American boy. This is not simply about getting the racist out of our schools, because he actually thought he was doing his job very well. But the way we've defined these jobs are not about keeping kids in, it's been about pushing them out. And so we've got to reflect on how much of that approach has been built into the way we think things should be done to keep schools safe and orderly. We rarely ask whether or not what we're doing is working. Right? Even though I go to schools where they're suspending some of the kids over and over again, the same kids. After a while, you'd have to say, well, clearly this is not working. I was at a school in Cleveland, Ohio, talking to the principal. Boy comes in, and he says, principal says, "You've been cutting, haven't you?" He says, "Yes, I have." He says, "Well, you're going to get suspended 3 days." Boy says, "Give me 5 days this time. I want 5. He says, "Okay, smart aleck, you get 5 days. So I'm sitting watching. Boy leaves. I say, "Do you really think this is going to work?" He says, "Well, it's not going to change the cutting, but it's going to get him out of my hair for 5 days. I would say that we're using discipline now to get rid of the kids we don't want to serve. Lawrence Kohlberg, a psychologist writing about moral development in the 1970s, says the goal of discipline is not to teach kids to avoid punishment. It is to teach kids to do what is right, even when we're not looking. Think about, if that were really the goal, what would be different about discipline practices in schools? I go to so many schools that have all kinds of rules, right? Up about what you can and can't do. Rules against headphones, rules against cell phones, rules against different attire. I rarely go to schools that explicitly teach values like respect and kindness and empathy and honesty and integrity. And I would say if those values are not explicitly taught and totally embedded in the curriculum and modeled by the adults who work there, very hard to create truly civil, ethical communities, which is what we should be after. We have a fixation on the rules, but we don't have a fixation on how to build character. And I would say that that absence, that tendency to ignore these larger issues contributes to discipline policies that simply don't work and don't produce change. We see too much emphasis on exclusion and humiliation. Most schools start with humiliation, work their way to exclusion. Too much emphasis on locating the problem in the child and ignoring the way in which the environment may in fact be contributing to the behavior. It's not to say there aren't some children out there with serious needs and issues. There are. And there are many schools that don't have the resources, the expertise to meet their needs. I was meeting with a group of principals in New York City, schools that with very high superintendent suspension rates. Principal of one of the schools said, "We suspend because we lack other tools." And someone said, "Can you elaborate on that?" He said, "Well, I had a student who just enrolled in my school. He had recently been released from Rikers Island. Rikers Island, if you don't know, is the second largest penal institution in the world. He shows up without a parent to enroll in school. Principal says, well, I'm going to meet him halfway. I'm going to take him. Seems like he's demonstrating some responsibility. That same day, within a few hours, the boy had been in 2 fights and punched a teacher. And then the principal discovered that he was bipolar and had no medication. Now, I would say a system, because New York City controls Rikers, and the Department of Education controls the schools at Rikers. They could have at least sent a note letting him know he's coming, right? Make sure he gets his meds. The systems have total breakdown. And because the systems have so many design flaws, we have kids falling right through the cracks. And I was remarking on it today when we saw a man hit by a car in the street, just across the street from the district's office. The number of homeless people on our streets today, right, who are mentally ill, right, is an outrage. But not a lot of outrage voiced about it. Because in effect, once we closed the mental hospitals, we turned our prisons into mental institutions. Right? Rikers Island, over 30% of the people incarcerated are mentally ill. And we are one of few countries that uses solitary confinement as a form of punishment on juveniles. On juveniles. So there's a lot that's wrong with what we're doing. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the rules that we've adopted in schools don't help kids to get re-engaged. One of the things we've known for a long time is kids who become discouraged, kids who are not successful, have very little incentive to behave. That's because school is based on a social contract, an unwritten contract between the student and the school. In exchange for an education, we expect that student to conform to the basic rules and norms. Which kids are least likely to conform? The kids who are not getting an education. If we don't find a way to re-engage them, to make sure that they understand why they're there, that in fact their learning needs are being met, we will continue to find large numbers of kids who are alienated and in many cases acting out. So we've got to get smarter at how we approach this. We've got to get more willing to design schools